The blind man sat motionless at the Thanksgiving table, his cane resting against the chair, but what no one knew, especially not the woman who had divorced him 3 years ago, was that behind those unseeing eyes was the multi-billionaire CEO of the real estate empire her father had managed for 2 decades. Her mother, emboldened by wine and contempt, scraped cold turkey and congealed gravy onto a paper plate, but instead of setting it before him with even minimal dignity, she threw the leftovers directly at his chest, the food splattering across his carefully pressed shirt as her daughter's lover stood behind her, mocking his cane with crude imitations that made the entire family laugh. The blind man didn't flinch, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the napkin in his lap, a gesture that would have warned anyone who truly knew him that something devastating was about to unfold. She watched from across the room, her conscience barely stirring, but she couldn't have imagined that the revelation he was about to deliver would destroy not just her future, but her mother's carefully constructed world, leaving the older woman weeping on her knees before the night ended. What had this blind man endured during their marriage that she had been too blind herself to see? What did her father really know about the man he reported to every single day? And why had he never spoken a word of it? And what could this man possibly reveal that would transform mockery and cruelty into ashes in their mouths? The dining room of the Fletcher estate smelled of roasted turkey and simmering resentment, but beneath those surface scents lurked something far more complex, the accumulated weight of 3 years of carefully maintained lies. Diane Fletcher had orchestrated this Thanksgiving with military precision, but her true objective had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with humiliation. Her daughter Rebecca sat at the head of the table, her hand intertwined with Travis Buckley's, but the smile on Rebecca's face didn't quite reach her eyes, a detail her mother either didn't notice or chose to ignore. The blind man, Ethan Mercer, occupied the chair furthest from the fire, but even in that position of deliberate exclusion, he maintained a posture of quiet dignity that seemed to irritate Diane more than if he had protested. His cane, a simple black affair with a silver handle, leaned against his chair, but Diane had already made 3 separate comments about it being a tripping hazard, each observation delivered with a smile that never touched her eyes. "I still don't understand why he's here," Travis muttered to Rebecca, but his voice carried across the table with perfect clarity, a fact that seemed intentional rather than accidental. "This is supposed to be a family gathering." Rebecca's fingers tightened around her wine glass, but she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the window where early winter darkness had already consumed the garden. She had invited Ethan, or rather she hadn't fought her father when Gerald Fletcher had insisted on it, but the reasons behind that insistence remained opaque to her, a mystery wrapped in her father's increasingly cryptic behavior over the past month. Gerald himself sat in silence, but his eyes never left Ethan's face, studying the blind man with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He had aged a decade in the past 3 weeks, but no one at the table seemed to notice except perhaps Ethan, who couldn't see the transformation but could certainly hear it in the tremor that had crept into Gerald's voice. "The turkey's getting cold," Diane announced, but she made no move to begin serving, her attention fixed instead on Ethan with the focused malice of a cat watching a mouse. "Though I suppose some people at this table are used to eating cold food, or scraps." Ethan's lips curved slightly, but the expression couldn't quite be called a smile. It was something older and sadder, the look of someone who had heard variations of this insult so many times that it had lost its sting. Rebecca felt something twist in her stomach, but she told herself it was indigestion rather than guilt. A rationalization she had perfected over 3 years of convincing herself that divorcing Ethan had been the right decision. The marriage had lasted 5 years, but Rebecca could barely remember why she'd said yes in the first place. They had met at a gallery opening, or so she told people, but the truth was more mundane. A coffee shop near the university where she'd been finishing her master's degree. Ethan had been sitting alone, a book in Braille open before him, but he'd been smiling at something, some private joke or pleasant memory, and that smile had captivated her. He'd been different then. Or perhaps she had been different, but either way something had shifted in the years that followed. His blindness had seemed romantic at first, even noble, but the reality of life with a disabled partner had worn on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The constant accommodations, the well-meaning but exhausting questions from strangers, the knowledge that certain experiences would forever be unavailable to them. It had accumulated like snow, innocent flake by innocent flake, but eventually becoming a weight that threatened to bury her. Or so she had told herself, but Ethan had never once asked her to make those accommodations. He had navigated the world with a competence that made his blindness almost invisible, but Rebecca had insisted on treating him like fragile glass, and when he gently protested, she'd accused him of not appreciating her sacrifices. The real breaking point had come 3 years ago, but the details had blurred in Rebecca's memory, softened by time and repeated self-justification. There had been an argument, something about money, or rather her perception that they never had enough of it. But Ethan had remained maddeningly calm, pointing out that they were comfortable, secure, that wanting more for its own sake was a treadmill without a destination. She'd called him unambitious, but what she'd really meant was that she'd looked at her future and seen herself as the wife of a blind man who gave piano lessons to children and seemed content with that modest life. Meanwhile, her college friends were marrying doctors, lawyers, men who drove German cars and took vacations in Tuscany, but she was clipping coupons and shopping at outlet malls. Travis had appeared at exactly the right moment, or the wrong one depending on one's perspective, but Rebecca had convinced herself it was fate. He was everything Ethan wasn't. Sighted, ambitious, flashy, but most importantly, he made her feel like she deserved more than what she had. The affair had been brief and almost disappointingly predictable, but it had given her the excuse she needed to end the marriage. Ethan had signed the divorce papers without protest, but he'd looked at her with those unseeing eyes and said something that had haunted her ever since. "You're divorcing someone who doesn't exist, Rebecca, but I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." Now, 3 years later, Travis was making jokes about wedding venues, but his promises had a hollow quality that Rebecca had only recently begun to notice. He talked constantly about his real estate ventures, but none of them ever seemed to materialize, and his expensive car was actually leased, a detail she'd discovered by accident when a payment reminder arrived at her apartment. "Ethan," Gerald said suddenly, his voice cutting through the ambient conversation, but before he could continue, Diane stood abruptly. "Let me make a plate for our special guest," she said, but the way she emphasized special transformed it into an insult. She moved to the sideboard where the turkey carcass sat, but instead of selecting the best pieces, she scraped together the driest edges, the bits of skin that had burned, the stuffing that had stuck to the pan. Rebecca watched her mother work, but a sense of unease was building in her chest, a feeling that something was spiraling out of control. Her father looked like he might be sick, but when she tried to catch his eye, he deliberately looked away. Diane piled the sorry excuse for a meal onto a paper plate, not even the good china that everyone else was using, but a flimsy paper plate from a package they kept for picnics. But this was something else entirely, something that crossed a line Rebecca hadn't even known existed. "Here you go," Diane said brightly, but instead of placing the plate on the table in front of Ethan, she simply opened her hands and let it fall. The plate hit Ethan's chest and tumbled into his lap, but the food scattered across his shirt, gravy staining the white fabric, stuffing clinging to his collar. The room went silent, but it was the silence of held breath, of witnesses to something that couldn't be taken back. Ethan sat perfectly still, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Oops," Diane said, but there was triumph in her voice, the satisfaction of someone who had finally delivered a blow they'd been planning for years. "How clumsy of me." Travis laughed, actually laughed, but the sound had a nervous edge that suggested even he sensed they'd gone too far. He stood and walked behind Ethan's chair, but instead of offering to help clean up the mess, he grabbed Ethan's cane and began using it to mime walking with exaggerated, stumbling steps. "Help! Help! I can't see where I'm going," Travis said in a mocking falsetto, but he swung the cane wildly, nearly knocking over a lamp. "Someone save me from the scary furniture." Rebecca felt frozen, but some distant part of her recognized that she should intervene, should stop this, but she couldn't seem to make her voice work. Her father had gone pale, but his hands were trembling so badly that he had to set down his wine glass before he dropped it. Ethan reached up slowly and brushed the food from his shirt, but his movements were careful, controlled, the actions of someone who had endured worse and survived. He found his napkin and cleaned his hands, but he didn't stand, didn't shout, didn't give them the reaction they seemed to want. "Are you finished?" he asked quietly, but his voice carried an authority that seemed to suck the air from the room. Travis stopped mid-swing, but he tried to maintain his bravado, tossing the cane carelessly back toward Ethan's chair. It clattered against the wall and fell to the floor, but Ethan didn't react. "Gerald," Ethan said, but he wasn't asking. He was commanding, and somehow that single word carried more weight than all of Diane's theatrical cruelty. "I think it's time." Gerald stood on shaking legs, but when he tried to speak, nothing came out. He cleared his throat and tried again, but the words emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Everyone needs to sit down," Gerald said, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "There are things you need to know." "What things?" Diane demanded, but for the first time uncertainty flickered across her face. "Gerald, what's going on?" Gerald moved to the sideboard and retrieved his briefcase, not the worn leather one he carried to work every day, but a different one, sleeker and newer, but one Rebecca had never seen before. His hands shook as he opened it, but he pulled out a stack of documents. "I've worked at Meridian Holdings for 23 years, Gerald began, but he couldn't look at his wife or daughter. "Started as an assistant property manager, worked my way up to senior director. I've been proud of what I built." "What does this have to do with—" Diane started, but Gerald cut her off with an uncharacteristic sharpness. "Meridian Holdings isn't just a company," Gerald continued, but sweat had broken out on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. "It's the largest private real estate empire in North America, $40 billion in assets, properties in every major city. But what none of you ever knew, what I was contractually forbidden from revealing, was who actually owns it." Rebecca felt her heart begin to pound, but she told herself she was being ridiculous, that whatever her father was about to say couldn't possibly be what her lizard brain was already screaming at her. Gerald turned to look at Ethan, but his expression was equal parts reverence and despair. Ethan Mercer founded Meridian Holdings 17 years ago with an inheritance from his grandmother. But he didn't just found it, he built it brick by brick, deal by deal. But he did it all from behind the scenes using proxies and shell companies because he knew that if people discovered the CEO was blind, they'd never take him seriously. The words hung in the air like smoke, but no one seemed able to process them. Travis had gone pale, but his mouth opened and closed without sound. Diane's carefully applied makeup suddenly looked garish, her face draining of color beneath the rouge. "That's ridiculous," Rebecca heard herself say, but her voice sounded thin, unconvincing even to her own ears. Ethan teaches piano to children. He lives in a tiny apartment He lives in a penthouse in the Callaway building, Gerald interrupted, but there was no satisfaction in his voice, only a deep, bone-weary sadness. The entire top floor. But he also maintains a small apartment in the neighborhood where you used to live, Rebecca, because even after the divorce, he couldn't quite bring himself to completely sever that connection. Ethan finally stood, but his movements were fluid, controlled, nothing like the helpless invalid that Diane and Travis had been mocking. He bent and retrieved his cane without fumbling, but the action was so precise that it was clear he knew exactly where it had fallen. Gerald has been one of my most trusted executives for 2 decades, Ethan said, but his voice had changed, shed some layer of protective softness to reveal steel beneath. But 3 weeks ago I discovered something troubling. Money had been disappearing from several properties. Nothing dramatic, just enough to slip past most audits, but patterns emerged for those who knew where to look. Gerald made a sound that might have been a sob, but he didn't protest or defend himself. His shoulders slumped, but he seemed to be aging in real time, collapsing inward like a building with its supports removed. Gerald didn't take the money for himself, Ethan continued, but he turned his head toward where Diane sat frozen. He took it to cover debts, gambling debts specifically, but not his own. The silence that followed was absolute, but into it, Diane's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her eyes widened, but then narrowed, calculating, already searching for a way to spin this, to make herself the victim. "You can't prove," she started, but Ethan simply held up one hand. "I can prove everything," he said quietly, but the words landed like hammer blows. Bank transfers, casino records, even video footage. But what's interesting is that Gerald didn't embezzle to enable your addiction, Diane. He did it because you threatened to destroy his marriage, his reputation, everything he'd built if he didn't pay your debts. "That's a lie," Diane shrieked, but she was on her feet now, knocking over her chair in her haste to stand. "Gerald, tell them it's a lie." Gerald didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. He looked at his wife with the eyes of a stranger, but there was something like pity in his expression, the kind of pity reserved for disasters that might have been prevented. "Travis," Ethan said, but now his attention shifted to the younger man who had been trying to inch toward the door. "You've been telling Rebecca about your real estate ventures, your investments, your bright future. But what you haven't told her is that every property you've claimed to be flipping has actually been one of mine, or rather, Meridian's. You've been working as a day laborer on my construction sites, but you've been telling everyone you're a developer." Travis's face went from pale to flushed, but his hands clenched into fists. You don't know." "I know everything," Ethan said, but there was no heat in his voice, just a terrible final certainty. "I know about the 3 credit cards you've maxed out. I know about the loan sharks who've been looking for you. I know about the other girlfriend in Newark who thinks you're going to marry her too. But most importantly, I know that you targeted Rebecca specifically because you found out her father worked at Meridian, and you thought you could use the connection to get a real job." Rebecca felt the room tilt, but she gripped the table to steady herself. Everything was coming apart, but the pieces were reassembling into a picture she couldn't bear to look at. Her mother wasn't the sharp-tongued but devoted woman she'd pretended to be, but a gambling addict who had blackmailed her own husband. Travis wasn't her ticket to a better life, but a con artist who had been using her. And Ethan. She turned to look at him, but really look at him for the first time in years, and saw not the helpless invalid she'd divorced, but a man who had built an empire while teaching piano lessons to maintain his privacy, who had endured her cruelty and her betrayal, but who had never once used his power to hurt her in return. You knew, Rebecca whispered, but the words came out broken. When we were married, you knew all of this. About my mother, about everything. Ethan's expression softened slightly, but the sadness in it was almost unbearable. I knew your mother had a problem. I tried to tell Gerald to get her help, but he thought he could handle it himself. But as for you, Rebecca, I never told you about my business because I wanted to know if you could love me as just a man, not as a bank account, and I got my answer. The cruelty of that truth was surgical, but Rebecca couldn't even argue with it. She had divorced him because she'd thought he wasn't enough. But the entire time he'd been testing her, and she'd failed so spectacularly that the irony would have been funny if it wasn't destroying her. Diane had begun to weep, but they weren't delicate tears. They were great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She reached for Gerald, but he stepped back, his face a mask of controlled devastation. I'm turning myself in, Gerald said quietly, but he pulled an envelope from his briefcase and set it on the table. My resignation and full confession, but I'm also filing for divorce, Diane. Our marriage is over. You can't, Diane wailed, but she lurched toward him, mascara streaming down her face in black rivers. Gerald, please, we can fix this. I'll stop gambling. I'll get help. You should have gotten help 10 years ago, Gerald said, but his voice was empty of emotion, drained of everything except exhaustion. You should have gotten help before you stole from our retirement fund, before you forged my signature on loan documents, before you blackmailed me into committing crimes that will probably send me to prison. He turned to Ethan, but his expression was pleading. I know I don't deserve mercy. I know I've betrayed your trust, betrayed everything you built, but I'm begging you, don't let this destroy Rebecca. She didn't know. She's innocent in all of this. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, but his unseeing eyes seemed to look through Gerald, through the walls, to some distant horizon only he could perceive. Rebecca is innocent of your crimes, Gerald, but she's not innocent of her own choices. However, and here his voice softened infinitesimally, I have no intention of punishing her for your mistakes, or her mother's, or even her own. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, but he didn't hand it to Rebecca. Instead, he set it on the table and slid it in her direction with uncanny accuracy. That's the number for my personal attorney, Ethan said. When you're ready, not now, but when you've had time to process all of this, call her. There's a trust fund in your name. Has been since a month after our divorce. I set it up because despite everything, I wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of if anything happened to me. But I made it inaccessible until either my death or, he paused, or until circumstances revealed themselves in a way that required intervention. I don't want your money, Rebecca said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. It's not about what you want, Ethan replied, but his voice was gentle, the tone of someone explaining something to a child. It's about making sure you have options. Your father is going to prison, Rebecca. Your mother is going to lose everything. And Travis, he turned his head toward where the younger man stood. Travis is going to disappear from your life, probably sometime in the next 24 hours, because men like him always do when the money runs out. Travis opened his mouth, but whatever protest he'd been planning died unspoken. Instead, he simply turned and walked toward the door, but his footsteps were quick, almost running, the sound of a rat deserting a sinking ship. "Coward!" Diane shrieked after him, but then she rounded on Rebecca. "This is your fault. If you'd stayed married to him, if you'd just been patient, we could have had everything. But you had to divorce him, had to throw it all away, and now look at us." The accusation was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that Rebecca actually laughed, but it was a broken sound, edging toward hysteria. "You're blaming me? You're the one who gambled away our family's future. You blackmailed Dad, you—" But she couldn't continue. her voice fracturing into something that might become sobs if she let it. Ethan moved toward the door, but his navigation was perfect, no fumbling or hesitation, and Rebecca realized he'd probably memorized the layout of the room the moment he'd entered. He paused at the threshold and turned back, but his expression was unreadable. "I didn't come here tonight to destroy anyone," he said quietly, but his words seemed to fill the entire space. "I came because Gerald asked me to, because he wanted to confess before I filed criminal charges, and because he hoped I might show mercy to his family. But what happened here tonight, your mother's cruelty, Travis's mockery, that wasn't my doing. That was all of you revealing who you really are when you think there are no consequences." He tapped his cane once against the floor, but the sound was sharp. "Final. Gerald will face justice, but I'll make sure his lawyer is the best money can buy. Your mother will need to find treatment for her addiction, but I've already arranged for a facility to accept her if she chooses to go. And you, Rebecca," his voice softened one last time, "you need to figure out who you want to be, not who your mother wants, not who Travis pretended you could be, but who you actually are underneath all the expectations and disappointments." "Wait," Rebecca said, but she stood on trembling legs, one hand reaching out toward him, even though he couldn't see the gesture. "I'm sorry for everything, for not appreciating you, for divorcing you, for—" But the list was too long, and she choked on it. Ethan smiled, but it was sad, the expression of someone who had already done their grieving and come out the other side. "I know you are, but sorry doesn't change the past, Rebecca. It only informs the future, and that future is yours to build, but you'll have to do it without me in it. I loved you once, truly, deeply loved you, but I've spent 3 years learning to let that go. Tonight was supposed to be closure for your father, but I think it might have been closure for me too." He walked through the door and into the hallway, but his footsteps were steady, confident, the gait of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Rebecca heard the front door open and close, but she couldn't move, couldn't process anything beyond the wreckage surrounding her. Her mother had collapsed into a chair and was weeping into her hands, but the sound was almost animalistic, stripped of all pretense and dignity. Her father stood like a statue, but tears ran silently down his face, collecting in the creases around his mouth. And Rebecca stood in the middle of the ruins of Thanksgiving dinner and felt the full weight of her choices crash down upon her. She had married a good man, but had been so focused on what he couldn't give her that she'd never bothered to notice what he could. She had divorced him because she wanted more, but had ended up with less. So much less that the emptiness threatened to swallow her whole. The business card still lay on the table, but Rebecca picked it up with shaking fingers. The name embossed on it meant nothing to her, but the weight of what it represented was crushing. Mercy from someone she didn't deserve it from, a future purchased with someone else's generosity, a second chance she had neither earned nor requested. She thought about Ethan navigating the world in darkness, but doing so with more grace and certainty than she'd ever managed with sight. She thought about him building an empire in secret, but not because he was ashamed of his blindness, because he wanted to prove to himself that he could do it, that his worth wasn't defined by others' perceptions. She thought about him sitting through tonight's humiliation, but enduring it because he'd promised a frightened man he'd hear him out before destroying him. And she thought about herself, the woman who had looked at that man and seen only limitations, but never the possibilities, the woman who had thought she deserved better, but hadn't even deserved him. "What do we do now?" her mother asked, but her voice was small, childlike, all her venom drained away to leave only fear and grief. Rebecca looked at her father, but he shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but I'm going to face what's coming. I'm going to serve my time, but maybe I can come out the other side as someone better, someone who should have protected his family instead of enabling the person destroying it. The words were hard, but necessary, and Rebecca felt something shift inside her. Not redemption, because she was nowhere near earning that, but perhaps the first tiny step toward understanding. She had been so focused on what Ethan couldn't see that she'd blinded herself to what he could. The truth about people, about character, about the difference between what someone wants and what they need. She looked down at the business card again, but this time, instead of seeing it as charity, she tried to see it as Ethan had meant it. A tool, neutral in itself, but whose value would be determined by how she chose to use it. She could take the money and rebuild a life of shallow comfort, but she could also take it and try to become someone worthy of the gift, someone who helped others the way Ethan had helped her, but even when she didn't deserve it. The choice, as Ethan had said, was hers, but for the first time in 3 years, she understood the weight of such choices and how the person you become is built not from what you're given, but what you do with it. Behind her, her mother's weeping had subsided into quiet hiccups, but the sound of it would probably haunt Rebecca for the rest of her life, not because it represented her mother's destruction, but because it represented the moment everything hidden was finally revealed, and all the careful lies collapsed under the weight of truth. And somewhere in the city, Ethan Mercer was probably removing his stained shirt, but not with anger or bitterness, just the practical acceptance of a man who had learned long ago that other people's cruelty said everything about them and nothing about him. He would shower, but change into comfortable clothes and perhaps sit at his piano and play something beautiful in the darkness that was his constant companion, but never his prison. Tomorrow, lawyers would begin the work of untangling Gerald Fletcher's crimes, but they would do so with Ethan's resources behind them, minimizing damage where possible. Tomorrow, Diane Fletcher would either check herself into treatment or continue her spiral, but that choice would be hers alone. Tomorrow, Travis Buckley would wake up in some cheap motel, but already planning his next mark, his next scheme, his next attempt to get something for nothing. And tomorrow, Rebecca would begin the slow, painful work of figuring out who she was beneath all the expectations and disappointments, but with the knowledge that she had been given a gift she didn't deserve, from a man who owed her nothing, who had endured her worst, but who had still chosen mercy over revenge. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, but the sound seemed to mark not just the end of a day, but the end of an era, the death of illusions, but the birth of something raw and honest in their place. Whatever came next would be built on truth rather than comfortable lies, but that truth was harsh enough to strip skin from bone. Rebecca gathered the business card, but her purse and her keys, because staying in this house another moment felt impossible. Her parents would have to navigate their own crises, but she needed air, space, distance from the wreckage. As she walked to her car, but the night air bit at her skin, she found herself thinking about the Ethan she'd married versus the Ethan who had sat at that table tonight. She had thought they were different people, but they weren't. She had simply been too blind to see him clearly, and that blindness had been self-inflicted, born from her own shallow desires and unexamined assumptions. She started the engine but didn't immediately drive away. Instead, she sat in the darkness and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd lost. Not the money or the power or the security, but the man himself. The one who had loved her despite her flaws, but who had finally learned to stop, and who had moved on to become someone whole and complete without her. And Rebecca wept, not the theatrical tears of her mother, but quiet, aching sobs that came from somewhere deep and true, the sound of someone finally seeing themselves clearly, but hating what they saw. But beneath that self-loathing was something else, something small but persistent, the faint, fragile hope that perhaps it wasn't too late to become someone better. Not for Ethan, because that ship had sailed, but for herself, for the possibility that she might someday be able to look in a mirror and not see a person who had traded gold for glitter, but who had been too foolish to know the difference until it was gone. She put the car in drive and pulled away from her parents' house, but she didn't know where she was going. It didn't matter, but somewhere in the city was a future waiting to be built. And for the first time in years, she understood that the building would require work, real, hard, unglamorous work, but that perhaps if she was willing to do it, she might emerge as someone who deserved the mercy she'd been shown. The road stretched ahead into darkness, but Rebecca drove forward anyway, because sometimes that's all you can do. Keep moving, keep trying, keep hoping that the person you become tomorrow might be just slightly better than the person you were yesterday. And somewhere behind her, in a house that reeked of turkey and broken dreams, her parents were beginning their own reckonings, but those stories were theirs to write. This story of blind love and blinded fools, but ultimately of truth revealed and mercy given, was Rebecca's now, and whatever she made of it would determine whether tonight's destruction had been the end of everything or the beginning of something new. The choice, as always, was hers.